Hi, Mateo. Good evening.
Good evening, teacher.
Today we're going to be doing what we're supposed to do on Friday. Unfortunately, I don't know.
Okay, teacher, I'm sorry. I don't know if you can hear me, but I think your Wi-Fi is a little low.
Oh, really? You can hear me?
Now I can hear you. Before I didn't hear you, but now yeah, it's all right.
Okay. Can you see my screen as well?
Yeah, your screen. I can see your screen.
Okay, perfect. Thank you for that.
It's fine.
So what we're going to do today is we're going to be practicing the second part of the listening to finish with the listening part, which is the conversations part of the listening. I'm sorry, lectures. We've already practiced conversations. We've seen lectures, the theory on Thursday, actually. And now we're going to be practicing TOEFL lectures, as many lectures as we can, and answering the questions that. So please, I want you guys to get ready to take notes. Remember that you have to try to take notes as realistically as you can. So try to simulate the real test, whether you're taking the test at home or in a test center. Try to take notes in the way that you will in the actual test. Okay, guys, so please get ready, get a piece of paper or your whiteboards, your markers, or maybe your pen, depending on where you'll take the test. And get ready to take notes because I'm going to be playing our first lecture. Unless, of course, you have any questions before we start. Do you guys have any questions?
No, teacher, everything is in order.
Okay, guys. Perfect. So let's get started.
Listen to part of a lecture in a world history class.
Now, according to Chinese legend, the first person to drink tea was a Chinese emperor who lived nearly 5,000 years ago. This emperor was, you could call him an amateur scientist, and he wisely required all drinking water to be boiled for hygiene. So once, when visiting some distant part of his empire, he noticed that a breeze had blown some leaves into his pot of boiling water, and these leaves turned the water kind of brown. So, well, would it be your first impulse to drink this? Probably not. But he thought the resulting brew smelled pretty good, and in the name of science and discovery, he tasted it, and the practice of drinking tea was born. Well, a good story, but actually we cannot say with any certainty just who first discovered how to make tea. We can be confident, though, that the Chinese have been using it in some form for close to 5,000 years. And from those earliest times, more and more tea was cultivated to meet the growing demand, and tea became an important part of the economy of China. In fact, it was formed into sort of bricks and used as a common type of currency for trade. But its effect on Chinese culture was even more profound. Tea became extremely popular in China, and scholars even wrote works discussing how to grow tea, prepare it, drink it, really championing tea. One of them saying it was like the sweetest dew of heaven. Now, recommendations like this could only add to its huge popularity there. But tea was also spreading throughout Asia. In Japan, perhaps even more than in China, tea became a major cultural symbol and one of refinement, of etiquette and aesthetics. Best seen in the traditional Japanese tea ceremony, which is still performed today. This is an intricate formal ritual, a ceremony that can take hours to complete. Clearly, tea became not just a beverage in Japanese culture, but much, much more. Tea eventually got to Western Europe after European traders, mainly Portuguese and Dutch, brought the first small commercial shipment of tea back to Europe. Unfortunately, it was mostly just treated as a curiosity, since no one knew quite how it was supposed to be used. A few had some pretty strong opinions, though. One German doctor wrote a book saying tea was harmful, actually poisonous. But at about the same time, another doctor from Holland wrote another book calling tea a miracle cure for just about everything. Who to believe? So, anyway, tea didn't really catch on in Germany or France as something just to enjoy drinking. They seemed to prefer coffee. But England did take to tea, and to an extent that nobody could have foreseen, such that even today we tend to associate England, Great Britain, with tea. And, a bit of perspective. At the start of the 18th century, almost nobody in England drank tea. But by the end of it, almost everybody did. By the 1750s, official records show tea imports up from almost nothing to about 20 million kilos. And those records didn't even begin to account for all the tea smuggled into the country illegally to avoid paying taxes. And as for reasons for the popularity of tea there, tea first became fashionable after the King of England married a Portuguese princess who loved tea. And pretty soon, more and more people started copying her and drinking tea. Later, when a direct trade route was established between China and England, the supply of tea greatly increased. Most important, though, tea drinking became sociable. And although coffee houses or taverns were generally considered to be for men only, tea shops became places where women could come and even bring their families. And soon there were tea parties, books on tea etiquette, and even tea gardens, parks filled with lights and walkways and venues for musical performances, places where people of all social classes could go to drink tea and socialize. By the end of the 18th century, all classes of English society drank tea, from royalty to common workers. Tea became a staple of everyday life, part of the common culture, and traditionally considered by many the very mark of being English.
Okay, guys. So that was our lecture. Can you guys tell me what it was about?
It was about the origin of tea, how this drink gets popular in different countries, especially in England.
They're great. Exactly. It was about the history of tea. First of all, they talked a little bit about the origin of tea. They talked about one legend. Then they talked about who were the first people who started drinking tea, how it spread throughout Europe, and how it was received in different countries. And at the end of the day, as you said, how England received tea. Exactly, and its popularity. Let's take a look at the questions now. Our first question says, what is the main purpose of the lecture? What would you guys say? This is the main idea question.
The option B, I think, the second one.
Okay, to trace the historical development of tea drinking around the world. Do you guys agree? Does everyone agree?
And teacher, good evening. I will also say option B.
Okay, Walter, yes. What about the rest? Ignacio, Fernando?
Option B, teacher.
Perfect. So yes, it is definitely option B. As we said, it talks about the history of tea, right? How it began, how it spread, and they talk about different, even though they don't talk about the entire world, this is the closest one to express the purpose of the lecture, right? Because it wasn't just about the reasons of the rising popularity of tea drinking. It is true that they did mention this, but it's not about that, it's not just about England and its popularity there. They don't make any types of contrast or comparisons. So they don't contrast Asian tea drinking practices with European tea drinking practices, right? There's no comparison of similarities, differences, or anything. And cultural ritual, they do mention something like this about Japan, but again, it's just a minor detail. It's not the entire lecture. So yes. You guys, we can also select the correct option, option B. Let's see the next.
What is the professor's opinion about the origin of tea drinking?
What would you guys say? The professor's opinion.
The option C.
Okay, you sure?
I am not sure if it's the option C or the option D.
Right. So yes, the professor said, well, first the professor told the story of the Chinese emperor, right? And then she's like, well, haha, a nice story, but actually we cannot know for in certainty what was the origin of tea drinking, right? So actually you are right. It makes sense that you are going for C or D, but you have to choose one. So which one and why?
Then the option D, because I think she doesn't say the origin exactly. Where is the origin of tea?
Exactly. It's not that she doubts that tea drinking actually had its origin in China, because actually she says, well, we don't know with certainty what was exactly the origin of tea drinking, but we know that the Chinese people have been using tea probably for the longest time. So she doesn't doubt that tea drinking had its origin in China. She basically says that we don't know if that legend is true or not, right? If we replay this part again, first, let's see what the professor says in the beginning.
He was a Chinese emperor
In a world history class.
Now, according to Chinese legend, the first person to drink tea.
Right, so first she says according to Chinese legend.
Oh, would it be your first impulse to drink this? Did it? And the practice of drinking tea was born. Well, a good story, but actually we cannot say with any certainty just who first discovered how to make tea.
Right?
We can be confident, though, that the Chinese have been using it in some form for close to 5,000 years.
So yes, she's not doubting that that was the actual origin, but she says that we cannot know with certainty what was the origin of tea. So option B. The next.
The professor discusses the role of tea in China, Japan, and England. What does she emphasize as an important effect that tea had in all three countries?
So
I think the option D.
sorry, the use of tea supported the existing class structure of each country.
Yes, I think that's the one.
Okay. China, Japan, and England, what do they have in common as an important effect that tea had in all the countries? What about the rest? Do you guys agree? Anyone else? So actually, I don't think if I agree. Let's choose that one. Let's see which one is correct. We have option C is the correct. Tea drinking became a part of each country's cultural identity. So basically, if we look at the transcript, when she talks about China, what does she say? She says that close to 5,000 years. And then she says, in fact, it was formed into sort of bricks and used as a common type of currency for trade. But its effect on Chinese culture was even more profound. Tea became extremely popular in China, and scholars even wrote works discussing how to grow tea, prepare it, drinking, championing tea. So it had a great effect on Chinese culture, right? That's one thing. And then when she talks about Japan, she says, okay, guys, sorry. So that's what she said about China, right? That it had a profound effect on Japanese culture, in Chinese culture. Then when she talks about Japan, she says pretty much the same. She says, in Japan, perhaps even more than in China, tea became a major cultural symbol. And finally, she talks about England as well. And she says that England became perfect. It says, drinking tea became sociable, right? It became the very mark of being English. Tea became a staple of everyday life, part of the common culture and traditionally considered by many the very mark of being English. So basically what the three countries have in common is that the practice of drinking tea or of drinking tea became part of the culture, right? Part of each country's cultural identity. They don't talk about the existing class structure of each country. Right? They don't talk about class structures. They talked about culture, they talked about the economic effect in these countries as well, but they don't talk about classes. So option C in this case. It's a detailed question. Let's move on to the next.
According to the professor, why was tea not popular at first when it was brought to Europe?
What would you guys say?
Maybe the option D.
Okay, maybe option B. People did not know what to do with it. Okay, yes, probably. Do you guys agree? Anyone else?
I say letter D, teacher, too.
Okay.
Maybe.
People didn't know what to do with it exactly because the professor first talks about tea being spread to Europe, and the professor talks about France and Germany, right? And she says that people wasn't sure like what was the use of tea, and there were some scholars who said that tea was dangerous, but there were some other scholars that said that tea was like a cure for everything. So people at the end of the day didn't know what to do with tea, how to drink it, so they preferred coffee, right, as a beverage. They didn't know what to do with it exactly. Question 5.
What does the professor imply about 18th century records of the amount of tea imported into England?
What would you guys say? What does she imply? Anyone? The records of the amount of tea imported into England about in the 18th century. What does she say about that? If we take a look at what she says, if we see the transcript, what she said about the amount of tea that was imported into England, she says, okay, but England did take to tea, and to an extent that nobody could have foreseen, such that even today we tend to associate England, Great Britain, with tea. And well, a bit of perspective, at the start of the 18th century, almost nobody in England drank tea, but by the end of it, almost everybody did. By the 1750s, official records show tea imports up from almost nothing to about 20 million kilos. And those records didn't even begin to account for all of the tea smuggled into the country illegally to avoid paying taxes. What does she imply about the amount of tea imported into England? Anyone? Basically, she says, records show tea imports up from almost nothing to about 20 million kilos. And those records didn't even begin to account for all of the tea smuggled into the country illegally. So these records didn't even begin to account for all of the tea smuggled into the country illegally. So that means that these records are inaccurate, right? They're not accurate because they don't account for all of the tea that was imported illegally in order to avoid taxes. So they're inaccurate because so much tea was imported illegally. That's what she implies about the records, right? That they're not counting all of the tea that was brought into the country. Finally, we have question 6, which says, although I think it's already answered. See if we can. Okay. Okay, guys. So question 6.
Indicate whether each of the following is a reason the professor gives for the increased popularity of tea in England.
So the first reason, the king announced that people should drink more tea. Is that a reason given for the popularity of tea in England, or is that not a reason? Is that a reason that they don't mention? What do you guys think? Do they mention that? What do you think? They say that the king announced that people should drink more tea?
Teacher, I think it's not a reason given.
It's not, right? They don't say that. They do say something about the king and queen, but what they said is that actually the queen liked tea very much, right? She liked it a lot and she started popularizing it. But it was the queen, it wasn't the king. The king didn't make any announcements of that sort. But yes, that's not a reason given. What about the next? Many people wanted to imitate the new queen. Is that a reason that they give?
Yes, that's one reason.
Exactly, it is a reason, right? They do say that that people started to imitate the queen. A direct shipping route helped increase the supply of tea. Is that a reason? Do they mention a direct shipping route? They do, right? They said a direct trade route was established between China or Asia and Europe, right, in England, and that allowed them to import a lot of tea. So they do mention that. What about the next? Tea drinking became a social activity appropriate for everyone. Do they mention that?
I think they do mention that.
They do mention it, exactly. They do say that. People became more aware of the health benefits of tea. Do they say anything about the health benefits?
No, teacher.
They don't, right? They don't say anything about the health benefits. Okay, guys? So if we check the answers, then yes, we are correct, right? A is not a reason given. All of the three are reasons that were given, and finally the last one is not. Okay, guys. So what do you think so far? Do you have any questions about this lecture we did? Everything clear? Everything okay?
I think everything it's clear, teacher. Thanks.
Okay, guys, perfect. So let's do another one. Okay, get ready to take notes. Okay. Okay, guys, so let's listen to this lecture.
Listen to part of a lecture in an environmental science class.
The Chesapeake Bay on the east coast of the United States is huge, the largest estuary in the U.S., and it's very important to local economies. But, like many of the world's waterways, the Chesapeake is being polluted, and efforts to stop that from happening have not been entirely successful. And that's partly because of the type of pollution affecting the Chesapeake, which may not be what you might predict. First, let's mention that the sources of pollution are of two general types. And let's begin with what's known as point source pollution. Point source pollution has an identifiable source, and you can find the specific point where, say, one particular pipe is dumping pollutants into the bay, and then treat the water right there where the pollution's coming from. And that's what's happened over the past 30 years or so. Modifications have been made at factories and sewage treatment plants to treat polluted water before it's released into public waterways. But there's also something we call non-point source pollution. Nowadays, the most serious pollution threat doesn't come from any particular source, like a factory or sewage treatment plant, but originates from many sources over a large area. And this non-point source pollution is a challenge to deal with because it doesn't just enter the bay through one pipe. You can't identify precisely where it's coming from. And to be specific, the biggest problem now facing the Chesapeake Bay is due not to toxins, but to nutrients contained in chemical fertilizers used on farms all over the region. These nutrients, like phosphorus and especially nitrogen, wash away in what we call agricultural runoff. That's when water from a hard rain or from melting snow carries these chemicals down to streams and into the bay. And there they stimulate the explosive growth of algae. And that uses up much of the oxygen in the water, oxygen that fish and other aquatic organisms need to stay alive. So, since there's no single place you can treat the runoff before it reaches the bay, any efforts to reduce this non-point source pollution generally need to be aimed at keeping pollution out of the streams in the first place. But before we go into that, let's look at the role of nitrogen fertilizer in modern farming. Until about 60 years ago, before a great increase in industrialization, this wasn't a problem. In the past, farmers used natural fertilizers and rotated crops so that, in addition to commercial food crops like corn and wheat, they might plant legumes like alfalfa and clover for animal feed. But these legumes also enriched the soil by converting nitrogen in the atmosphere into nitrates, a form of nitrogen that crops like wheat or corn could use as a nutrient. And these and other cover crops, planted to hold the soil after the wheat or corn was harvested, they stored much of the surplus nitrogen during the time of the year when the runoff tended to be greatest. But farming practices changed as farmers came under pressure to use more and more chemical fertilizer in order to increase crop production on the same amount of land. But more isn't always better, at least in terms of chemical fertilizer in the environment. And along the way, farmers switched from legumes to animal feeds more suited to intensive, large-scale animal production. And the excess nitrogen, once trapped by these cover crops, either washed away in the next big rain or went down into the groundwater, and either way eventually ended up in the streams and the bay. And that, as we said, means more algae in the water and less oxygen for the fish and other aquatic life to breathe. So, what's being done? Well, two things. First, after the main crops are harvested, more farmers are planting cover crops again, other kinds like rye and barley that hold the nitrogen and keep it from washing out of the soil during the months when that's most likely to occur. And the second strategy is to plant buffer zones at the edges of streams, not crops, but natural areas, trees. The roots of these trees can absorb the excess nitrogen in the runoff before it reaches the streams. Farmers sometimes object to letting trees grow on land where they might otherwise be cultivating crops, but there's a government program that compensates them, that pays them for creating these buffer zones between their fields and the streams that eventually feed into bays like the Chesapeake. And it's beginning to show some success.
Okay, guys. So in this case, what was it about? In your own words, without getting to the question. What would you say it was about?
First, well, she talks about the point source pollution and non-point source pollution, that they doesn't come from any source, and well, the point source pollution comes with some sources to investigate them.
Yes, exactly. So first they start talking or classifying these two different types of pollution. They talk about how it affects crops and harvesting, and they also talk about what's being done to prevent this pollution, right? Or to reduce pollution. Let's take a look at the first question.
What is the lecture mainly about?
What do you guys think? What would you say? What is the lecture about?
Maybe option B.
Option C.
Option C or D, the causes for the large decrease in algae in the Chesapeake Bay, the development of farming methods during the past century. The source and treatment of serious depression. I mean, what would you guys say? What about the rest? I need somebody else to break the tie.
I think it's the option C.
Choose option C, let's see. So it's actually B, none of those are correct. The source and treatment of a serious type of pollution affecting this place. So it is limited to this place, right? They don't talk about methods during the past century. But let's see, let's take a look at the first part. It's usually in the introduction where you guys have the introduction.
Listen to part of a lecture in an environmental science class.
The Chesapeake Bay on the east coast of the United States is huge, the largest estuary in the U.S., and it's very important to local economies. But, like many of the world's waterways, the Chesapeake is being polluted, and efforts to stop that from happening have not been entirely successful. And that's partly because of the type of pollution affecting the Chesapeake, which may not be what you might predict. First, let's mention that the sources of pollution are of two.
Right, so that is the introduction. And yes, it talks about this place, and it talks about the fact that it's being polluted. And it says efforts to stop that from happening have not entirely been successful. And that's partly because of the type of pollution affecting this place, which might not be what you may predict. First, let's mention the sources of pollution are two general types. And let's begin with what's known as point source pollution. So it's about the source, which are the causes of pollution, right? And the treatment. They also talked about what is being done of this serious type of pollution that is affecting the Chesapeake Bay, right? So option B. Remember that during that introduction, during those first 30, 40 seconds, you guys shouldn't even be taking too many notes. It's about paying attention because there's always going to be one question that asks about the main idea, and that is answered in the first 30, 40 seconds of the lecture. So you better pay close attention to that part. Make sure that you really understand what the professor is saying because that is the topic. Right? Our next question.
What is one of the reasons that the professor mentions pollution that comes from a pipe?
What would you guys say? One of the reasons that the professor mentions pollution that comes from a pipe. Anyone? Why does the professor mention pollution that comes from a pipe?
Maybe option D.
Option D, to suggest new methods that may someday begin to reduce water pollution. Yes, do you guys agree?
Yes, teacher.
Okay. Anyone else? Anyone that disagrees? Okay, let's see. It's actually option A, to compare point source pollution with non-point source pollution. Let's see. Where does the professor mention pollution that comes from a pipe? Okay. Okay, so the professor says point source pollution has an identifiable source, and you can find a specific point where, say, one particular pipe is dumping pollutants into the bay, and then treat the water right there where the pollution is coming from. And that's what happened over the past 30 years or so. But there's also something we call non-point source pollution. Nowadays, the most serious pollution threat doesn't come from any particular source, like a factory or sewage treatment plant, or originates from many sources over a large area. And this non-point source pollution is a challenge to deal with because it doesn't just enter the way through one pipe. You can identify precisely where it's coming from. So the way that they are mentioning the type of pollution that comes from a pipe is to differentiate the both, right? Because point source pollution has an identifiable source, which is the pipe. But non-source pollution is the one that's not the source is whose source is not identifiable, right? It doesn't come from a pipe. So the reason why she mentions it is to compare, right? So point source pollution with non-point source pollution. Guys, so careful. Even the question kind of already answers it itself, right? Because it says, why does the professor mentions pollution that comes from a pipe? And remember that source pollution, point source pollution, or non-point source pollution, source basically means where it comes from, right? Where this pollution comes from. So point source pollution is the one whose source is identifiable, the pipe. And non-point source pollution is the one that we don't know the source, right? So option A in this case. Let's see our next question.
According to the professor, why has it been difficult for fish and many other organisms to live in the Chesapeake Bay?
What would you guys say? Why has it been difficult for fish and many other organisms to live in the Chesapeake Bay? Anyone?
Teacher, maybe letter D. I've heard of something about the oxygen in the water
Okay, oxygen level
reduced.
reduced. Okay, do you guys agree? Oxygen levels have been reduced.
Yes, teacher, I think it's the letter D too.
Let's see. So yes, in this case, oxygen levels in the water have been reduced. So why has it been difficult for fish and many other organisms to live here? Basically, okay. And that uses up much of the oxygen in the water, oxygen that fish and other aquatic organisms need to stay alive. So these organisms, fish and other aquatic organisms, need oxygen in the water, right? But these basically algae is draining all of that oxygen from the water. Question 4.
What is the professor's attitude about the use of chemical fertilizer?
What's her attitude about the use of chemical fertilizer? What do you guys think?
Maybe the option A or the option C, but I remember it got something to do to farmers.
Okay, so you say option A or D?
Yes, one of those two.
Okay. What about the rest? Use of chemical fertilizers. Her attitude. So let's see. So in the past, farmers used natural fertilizers and rotated crops so that in addition to commercial food crops like corn and wheat, they might plant legumes like alfalfa or clover for animal feed. But these legumes also enrich the soil by converting nitrogen into the atmosphere into nitrates and a form of nitrogen that crops like wheat or corn could use as a nutrient. Okay, but they don't say anything about fertilizers yet. But farming practices changed as farmers came under pressure to use more and more chemical fertilizer in order to increase crop production on the same amount of land. But more isn't always better, at least in terms of chemical fertilizer in the environment. And along the way, farmers switched from legumes to animal feeds more, okay? So more isn't always better, at least in terms of chemical fertilizer in the environment. So is she really surprised that farmers have stopped using it? Have farmers stopped using it, first of all? I don't think so, right? Farmers have actually started using it more than they did in the past. Now, she regrets that it was not more useful for increasing crop production. Actually, no, right? I think it would be
Letter
option
C, teacher? I'm sorry, excuse me. I was wondering. Letter C.
Yes, Walter, exactly. She worries farmers may be overusing it, using it too much, and it's not good for the environment. Yeah.
What two practices does the professor suggest for reducing the amount of nitrogen that enters a bay such as the Chesapeake?
So, food practices that the professor suggests for reducing the amount of nitrogen that enters a bay such as the Chesapeake. What do you think? We have to select two options.
I think A and B, teacher.
Planting trees along the sides of streams, building water treatment facilities where streams enter the bay. Yeah, it could be. Do you guys agree? Using the amount of nitrogen. Let's see. So what's being done to things? First, after the main crops are harvested, more farmers are planting cover crops again, other kinds like rye and barley that hold the nitrogen and keep it from washing out of the soil during the months when that's most likely to occur. And the second strategy is to plant buffer zones at the edges of streams, not crops, but natural areas, trees. right? So yes, I think planting trees is definitely one of them. I'm not sure about building water treatment facilities. Which one would it be? Planting cover crops, right? That hold the nitrogen and keep it from washing out of the soil during the months when that's more likely to occur. So cover crops that are going to take up the excess nitrogen in the soil. Detailed question. And finally, we have question 6.
According to the professor, why were farmers reluctant to create buffer zones near streams?
So why were farmers reluctant to create buffer zones? Here. The roots of these trees can absorb the excess nitrogen in the runoff before it reaches the stream. Farmers sometimes object to letting trees grow on land where they might otherwise be cultivating crops. But there's a government program that compensates them, that pays them for creating these buffer zones between their fields and the streams that eventually feed into bays like the Chesapeake. And it's beginning to show some success. So why are these farmers, why don't they want to create these buffer zones and plant trees? It says they object to letting trees grow on land where they could be cultivating crops. What happened there? What do they object? Because they fear that creating buffer zones might decrease farm income, right? Instead of cultivating crops, they're using that land to plant trees, which is a waste. And that's why the government is compensating them financially speaking. I think it might be B in this case, right? It says they refuse to letting trees grow land where they might otherwise be cultivating crops. So they're wasting land, which means they're wasting farm income, right? They could be doing something else with that land. Okay, guys, this was a little bit more difficult, I think, for most of you. You're struggling mainly with the detailed questions. So you might want to practice listening to academic content at different speeds. Maybe some of you guys are struggling due to the speed, maybe because of the vocabulary. So you might want to read about these topics, learn and expand your vocabulary, and obviously practice listening, to different types of content at different speeds, and your note taking, because you will need notes for these detailed questions. Guys? But what do you think? Do you have any questions about what we did today? Is everything clear? This lecture okay? Any questions?
I don't have questions so far, teacher, but yes, this part of the listening must be the most difficult part to me. Personally, I need to practice more, and you may know, it's always easier with subtitles. Sadly, we don't have subtitles, right, in this part of the TOEFL test. So yeah, I'm a little lost in the vocabulary too. I need to learn so much vocabulary. So, well, I'll start doing my best, teacher.
Yeah, well, they're great. Yes, that's the attitude. It is a little bit difficult, I think, for most students. The good thing is that it kind of balances out with the conversations, which tends to be easier. But yes, these lectures are difficult, especially if you don't have the academic vocabulary. The thing is, there are going to be a lot of technical words, right? But there are some that are repeated. For example, when you have history, a lot about cultures, and they start talking about the stones and archaeological evidence, findings and burials. So history, then you have these type of science lectures. When they talk about animals, words maybe like predator, prey, species, habitat. And in this case, it's about pollution. So perhaps some of the chemicals or some of the elements, nitrogen, oxygen. Those are always going to be like useful words. Same thing with harvesting crops. There's a lot about agriculture. So agricultural vocabulary always helps as well. So my suggestion, read and listen about these topics and try to learn the words from context. So vocabulary, and that's usually what is holding some students. But yes, it's possible.
Yes, teacher. I think so. Thank you.
Sure, guys. So any questions before we go? Guys, so please, we have a survey for today. I'm sending you guys our daily survey. Please don't forget to fill it out as you go, and I will be seeing you guys tomorrow in class.
Bye, teacher. See you tomorrow.
Bye, Mateo. Bye, guys.
Have a good night.
I'll see you tomorrow.
Bye.